Racist cop harasses black woman in court, then realizes who she is. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. In a packed courtroom, with the hum of whispers from the audience, Michael Turner, a police officer in his mid-30s with a reputation for arrogance, stood at the front, his posture rigid. His uniform was impeccable, yet his demeanor betrayed a man accustomed to wielding authority without question. His pale face remained stoic as the case against Jessica Williams was called. Jessica, a woman in her early 30s with a calm, yet assertive presence, walked into the courtroom. She was dressed professionally, her dark brown skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes, though soft, held a quiet strength, a strength forged from years of fighting battles that others couldn't see. The moment she entered, there was an immediate shift in the room. Michael's eyes flicked toward her with an unmistakable look of disdain. It was the same look he often gave to people who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged in spaces of power and authority. Jessica took her seat, her posture relaxed yet confident. She wasn't intimidated. This was just another fight, and she had fought many. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Michael was there as a witness, and, as the questioning started, his tone was sharp, pointed, and filled with judgment. Every word he spoke seemed designed to undermine Jessica's credibility. It was clear that he didn't believe her. As the questions became more invasive, Jessica's calmness never wavered. She answered with poise, her words cutting through the air with precision. But Michael wasn't listening to the content of her answers. His focus remained on something else. The more Jessica spoke, the more agitated he seemed. He threw subtle jabs at her, trying to provoke a reaction. He wasn't expecting her to stay composed, to turn the tables with such grace. And then, something changed. As Michael went through his routine, his eyes caught the edge of Jessica's legal documents. It wasn't just a name or a case number that registered. It was the title beneath it. His face shifted ever so slightly as the realization hit him. Jessica Williams wasn't just any woman sitting in front of him. She was a prominent community leader, someone who had fought for justice and equality for years. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It was a name he had heard in the news, a name associated with progress, with advocacy, with strength. Suddenly, Michael's harsh demeanor faltered. His voice wavered for a second, and his posture softened. It was clear that the woman he had so readily dismissed was far more than he had imagined. As Jessica continued, she spoke with even more conviction, as if knowing that the tide had begun to turn. Michael, now aware of who she truly was, could no longer hide the discomfort that crept up on him. The room seemed to hold its breath as the dynamic between the two shifted. What had started as an overt display of power had now become something far more complex. Jessica wasn't just a woman under scrutiny. She was a force to be reckoned with. Michael had made the mistake of assuming she was just another victim of the system he upheld. But now he was forced to confront the truth in front of him. In the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, Michael Turner stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The realization hit him harder than he anticipated. The woman he had been dismissing, the woman he had arrogantly assumed was just another victim of the system, was not who he thought she was. Jessica Williams was more than just a defendant in front of him. She was a powerful force in the community, someone whose name was tied to the fight for justice. He had heard about her, read about her, but in the moment of confrontation, he had failed to recognize her. His discomfort was palpable. His usual confidence started to crack, his posture straightening, but in a way that suggested unease rather than authority. As Jessica spoke, her calm, measured tone echoed through the room, filling the space with a sense of undeniable power. She wasn't just answering questions. She was making statements, ones that carried weight and conviction. She spoke of injustice, of the biases embedded in the system, of the daily struggles faced by people of color. Michael couldn't help but listen now, his previous arrogance slipping away. Jessica's words were sharp but composed, and she delivered them with such authority that it was impossible to ignore the truth in them. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, Michael felt a pang of guilt. The way she spoke wasn't just as a victim, but as a warrior who had seen the worst and still stood tall. His mind flashed back to his earlier interactions with her, how he had been dismissive, condescending, treating her like another statistic rather than a human being with her own story. His discomfort grew, but he couldn't bring himself to stop her. The courtroom had gone eerily silent, everyone watching, waiting to see how this exchange would unfold. The judge looked between the two of them, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Michael's body language betrayed his growing realization. He was no longer the figure in control. Jessica had taken the reins, and he was now at her mercy. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had never been good at admitting when he was wrong, but in that moment, he knew he couldn't continue his interrogation with the same arrogance. He had misjudged her, and that misjudgment was now clear for everyone to see. Jessica continued to speak, her voice unwavering. She shared stories of the countless times she had been overlooked, ignored, or silenced because of her skin color. She spoke not just for herself, but for countless others who had suffered in the same way. It was a testimony not just to the injustice she faced, but to the resilience she carried with her every day. Michael found himself reflecting on his own actions, his own biases. For the first time in a long while, he was confronted with the harsh reality of his own prejudices. His eyes flicked down to his notes, and he almost didn't recognize the man who had written them. The questions he had prepared seemed trivial now. Jessica was not just another person to be questioned. She was a symbol of strength, of a system that had failed her and many others, but also of the fight to make things right. As she finished speaking, the weight of the room seemed to shift. There was no applause, no dramatic gestures, just a profound silence that spoke volumes. Michael's face flushed as he realized just how much he had underestimated her. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of superiority that he had failed to see the bigger picture. It was a humbling experience, one that Michael knew would stay with him long after the trial was over. In the tense silence that followed Jessica's powerful words, Michael stood motionless. He had heard the truth in her voice, and it stung. His mind raced as he processed everything she had said, everything he had dismissed so carelessly earlier. For a moment, the room felt like it was closing in on him. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Jessica's calm composure had forced him to confront his own shortcomings, and that was a realization that was difficult to ignore. His hand trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes, but the questions he had prepared no longer seemed relevant. He had been so focused on his own assumptions about Jessica, and now he realized how deeply flawed his perspective had been. The whole courtroom seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to do something. But what could he say? He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't easily undo. As he glanced around, he noticed that even the judge, a woman known for her strict demeanor, was observing him closely. It was clear that the room had shifted, and Michael was no longer in control. Jessica, on the other hand, remained unshaken. Her eyes never left him, her gaze steady, as if she already knew the impact of her words. There was no anger in her expression, just a quiet strength, an unwavering conviction that was impossible to ignore. Michael swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that the words just wouldn't come. The arrogance that had once fueled his every action was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable self-awareness that he hadn't felt in years. The power dynamic had shifted, and now it was Michael who was on the defensive. Jessica's voice broke the silence once more, not with anger or hostility, but with a simple, direct question. "Why do you treat people like me differently?" she asked. The question hung in the air, challenging him to confront the truth. It was a question he had never really considered, and it left him speechless. How could he answer? How could he justify the prejudices he had so easily allowed to shape his actions? Jessica wasn't just asking about one incident. She was asking about a lifetime of systemic inequality, a lifetime of assumptions and biases that had governed his behavior. Michael knew that there was no easy way out of this. He couldn't simply brush it off. This moment was far more significant than any case he had ever worked on. As Jessica stood there, her presence filling the room with quiet power, Michael realized that he had just witnessed something far greater than a legal battle. He had witnessed a challenge to the very system he had spent his career upholding. The thought struck him with the force of a tidal wave. He had always considered himself a protector of the law, but now he wasn't so sure. The law he had spent so many years serving was not infallible. It was flawed, and it had failed people like Jessica time and time again. Jessica, however, was not defeated by that flaw. She had become a force of change, someone who would not be silenced by the system that had tried to break her. And in that moment, Michael realized that his role in this system was no longer as simple as he had once believed. He was forced to reckon with the fact that the law he upheld had been used to oppress, to judge, and to silence people like Jessica. The realization shook him to his core. There was no turning back from this understanding. As the trial continued, Michael found himself questioning every decision he had made in his career, every action he had taken, every assumption he had held. And for the first time, he wasn't sure where this path would lead him, but he knew one thing for certain. It would no longer be the same path he had walked before. In the days following the trial, Michael Turner found himself trapped in his thoughts. What was once a routine job had become an ongoing internal struggle. Every time he suited up in his uniform, the weight of his decisions from the courtroom felt heavier. His mind kept drifting back to Jessica Williams, her calm confidence, her unwavering strength, and the way she had confronted him with the truth. The woman he had once dismissed as just another case had forced him to confront not only his own biases, but the very system he had sworn to uphold. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Michael's usual arrogance, once a staple of his interactions, had started to disappear. He found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about the justice system, wondering if his role in it was as noble as he had always assumed. It was unsettling, this new awareness that gnawed at him every time he looked at his badge. It was as if the world had shifted under his feet, and he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Meanwhile, Jessica continued to carry herself with the same grace and dignity that had first captured Michael's attention. Her activism, her work in the community, and her fight for equality had not slowed down one bit. In fact, her appearance in court had only amplified her voice. The press coverage of her testimony had gone viral, with people from all walks of life praising her strength and courage. The case was no longer just about the law. It had become a symbol of a larger struggle. But despite the media frenzy, Jessica stayed focused. She knew that the road ahead was long, and the system wasn't going to change overnight. However, the ripple effects of her actions had already begun. Michael's internal conflict grew as the days went by. He found himself more distant from his colleagues, unable to engage in the casual conversations that once felt normal. He had begun to see his job through a different lens, one that was far less black and white than he had previously thought. The more he reflected on Jessica's words, the more he realized how deep-rooted the biases were within the system, within himself. One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift, Michael found himself sitting alone in his car, parked outside the precinct. He stared out the windshield, lost in thought. His fingers gripped the steering wheel as he replayed the moments in court. He had been so sure of his authority, so certain of his position in the system, but now all of that seemed irrelevant. His mind kept going back to that question Jessica had asked him, "Why do you treat people like me differently?" He didn't have an answer then, and he didn't have one now. But what he did know was that the question had unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. Michael had always prided himself on being a good cop, on doing the right thing. But now he had to ask himself, was he really doing the right thing? Was he truly upholding justice? Or was he just following the rules without questioning them? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions had been shaped by a set of assumptions he had never challenged. It wasn't just the case with Jessica. It was every case, every decision he had ever made. He was starting to see that the system he had devoted himself to might not be as fair as he had always believed. As the weeks passed, Michael began to take small steps toward understanding the flaws in the system. He started reading more about systemic inequality, about the historical and cultural biases that shaped the world around him. He began talking to people, listening to their stories in a way he never had before. Slowly, he began to open his eyes to the reality that had been hidden in plain sight. But the road to redemption wasn't easy. Michael knew that changing his perspective would take time, and that the work had only just begun. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of responsibility in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it. It had been a few months since the trial, but Michael Turner's transformation was far from complete. Every day, he walked through the precinct doors with a lingering sense of uncertainty, carrying the weight of his past decisions. He had started to make changes in his life, small ones but significant all the same. He had started attending workshops on bias and systemic racism, something he had never considered before. He had been reluctant at first, his ego still bruised from the realization that the system he believed in so strongly had its flaws. But every session chipped away at that initial resistance, and he began to understand more deeply the experiences of people like Jessica. He even started talking to his fellow officers, opening up conversations about race and justice. Many of his colleagues were dismissive, quick to fall back on the us versus the mentality that had shaped their views for years. But Michael wasn't willing to back down anymore. He started to push for change, however small, within his department. But no matter how much progress he felt he was making, Michael knew the road ahead would be long. He wasn't naive. He understood that changing years of ingrained prejudice, both in himself and in others, was not something that could happen overnight. As he walked into the precinct one morning, he noticed a familiar face. It was Jessica Williams, standing in the lobby, speaking to a group of officers. Michael paused, uncertain of what to do. After everything that had happened, after the months of reflection, he wasn't sure how to approach her. His mind raced, remembering how he had first judged her so harshly. But now he knew better. With a deep breath, he walked up to her. Jessica turned and saw him, her expression unreadable at first. Michael felt a flicker of discomfort, but quickly pushed it aside. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice sincere. "I just wanted to thank you." Jessica raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his approach. "Thank me for what?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. Michael hesitated for a moment, then continued. "For opening my eyes. For forcing me to see things differently. I've been trying to make changes, to do better." Jessica studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. It wasn't a look of judgment, but a look of quiet understanding. She had heard his name in the news, heard about his efforts to speak out against police brutality, and knew that something had shifted in him. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But it's not just about you. It's about all of us, about everyone who's been hurt by a system that's been broken for a long time. You can't fix it alone, Michael." Her words stung, but they were exactly what he needed to hear. It was a reminder that change wasn't just about his personal journey. It was about the collective fight for justice. Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in. He had known that before, of course, but hearing it from her made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm trying. Trying is a start," Jessica said, her voice softening. "But it's going to take more than that. It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take time. But I'm glad you're finally seeing it. That's the first step." Michael stood there for a moment, unsure of what else to say. But he didn't need to. They both understood the gravity of what was being said, even without words. As Jessica turned to leave, she offered him a small, knowing smile. Michael watched her go, feeling a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer afraid of it. He was ready to face the truth, to confront the system he had been part of, and to fight for something better. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. And for the first time in a long while, Michael knew he was on the right path. It had been several weeks since Michael's conversation with Jessica Williams, and though his journey toward change had only just begun, he felt the weight of his progress in every step he took. He continued attending workshops, reading books, and seeking out conversations with people who could help him better understand the complexities of race, justice, and systemic inequality. But it was the conversations with his colleagues that were the most challenging. Many of them were still resistant to change, clinging to the old narratives they had been taught. They laughed off his efforts, dismissed his newfound perspectives, and even mocked the idea of questioning the very system they served. Michael had expected resistance, but it still hurt to see how deep the divide ran. He was no longer just questioning his role within the police force. He was questioning the attitudes and behaviors of the very people he had once considered his comrades. Despite this, Michael continued to speak up. Every time a conversation turned to issues of race or police conduct, he spoke up. He no longer stayed silent, no longer allowed the old tropes and stereotypes to go unchallenged. Some days, the weight of it all felt unbearable, like he was carrying a burden that wasn't his to bear. But other days, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction, as if every small act of resistance against the status quo was a victory in itself. Meanwhile, Jessica's influence in the community only grew. She had become a beacon of hope for many, continuing to speak out about the injustices faced by people of color, and her efforts were making a difference. People listened to her because they knew she spoke from experience, because she had lived through the very struggles she so passionately advocated against. One evening, Michael attended a community meeting where Jessica was speaking. He had been invited by a colleague who was trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. It felt uncomfortable at first, walking into a room full of people who might still see him as just another officer representing a flawed system. But he pushed through the discomfort, knowing that it was his responsibility to be there, to listen, and to learn. Jessica was at the front of the room, speaking passionately about the need for accountability, for transparency, and for a system that truly served everyone, not just the privileged few. Her words were powerful, and Michael could feel the weight of them. He looked around the room and saw the faces of people who had been hurt by the system, people who had been ignored or treated unfairly for far too long. He felt the sting of shame in his chest, but it wasn't just shame for the mistakes he had made. It was also shame for the mistakes that had been made by the system as a whole. When Jessica finished speaking, she looked directly at Michael, her gaze steady and unflinching. He wasn't sure if she was acknowledging his presence or if she was simply looking at the room as a whole, but in that moment, he felt seen. After the meeting, they found themselves standing in the same hallway. Jessica didn't say anything at first, but her presence was enough. Michael took a deep breath, his heart racing as he approached her. "Jessica," he said softly, "I just want to say again how much I respect what you're doing. I know it's not enough to just say that. I'm still learning, but I'm trying." Jessica looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "Trying is all we can do," she said. "But remember, it's not about what you say. It's about what you do. Actions speak louder than words, Michael." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a reminder that the journey toward change wasn't just about talking the talk, but walking the walk. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of determination rise within him. He had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid of the path ahead. As he walked away from the meeting that night, he felt something inside of him shift once again. It wasn't just about proving himself to Jessica or to his colleagues or to anyone else. It was about proving to himself that he could be part of the change he so desperately wanted to see. And for the first time in a long while, Michael truly believed that he could. It had been 6 months since Michael Turner had started making small, yet significant changes to his life. He had taken on a new role within the department, one that allowed him to focus on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. It wasn't easy. The resistance from his colleagues had been constant. But Michael had learned that meaningful change didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened one conversation, one action at a time. He had made it his mission to attend community meetings regularly, to sit with people and to listen. Every time he spoke to someone who had been affected by the system he had once taken for granted, he learned something new. But it was still hard. Michael had never fully understood how deeply entrenched the biases were in the system, and every day he uncovered new layers of it. He would sometimes catch himself in moments of frustration, moments when he questioned whether the effort was worth it. But every time, his mind would return to Jessica's words. "It's not about what you say, it's about what you do." Her voice had become a guiding mantra, reminding him that his actions were what mattered. Jessica, on the other hand, had been as busy as ever. Her work in the community had only grown, and she had been working on launching an initiative aimed at reforming the criminal justice system from the ground up. She had come to realize that the fight for justice wasn't just about changing the minds of individuals. It was about changing the system itself. The initiative focused on holding law enforcement accountable, ensuring that those in positions of power were truly serving the people, not just perpetuating a cycle of inequality. But even with all of her success, Jessica knew that real change would take time. She could feel the weight of the fight, the relentless nature of it, but she refused to give up. One afternoon, Michael received a call from Jessica. She wanted to meet. Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. Over the past few months, they had spoken a few times, exchanged messages, but it had been a while since they had sat down in person. As he arrived at the cafe they had agreed to meet at, Michael saw her sitting by the window, as calm and composed as always. He approached her with a small smile, and she greeted him with a nod. "Good to see you, Michael," she said, her voice warm, but there was a certain seriousness to it. "Likewise," he replied, sitting across from her. They exchanged pleasantries for a moment, but Michael could tell that Jessica had something important to say. "I've been watching you," she said, leaning forward slightly, "and I've been hearing good things. I see the work you're doing. It's not easy, but it's important." Michael felt a rush of pride, but also a twinge of anxiety. "Thank you. I'm just trying to make things better," he said, his voice sincere. Jessica nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I know you are, and that's why I'm here. I've been working on something that I think you'd be perfect for." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I'm launching an initiative to reform the way law enforcement engages with the community," she said, her tone firm. "And I want you to be a part of it. You've already made the first step, Michael. But now, we need more people like you who are willing to put their actions behind their words. This is bigger than just one person. We need everyone on board." Michael sat in silence for a moment, processing what she was saying. He knew this was the kind of work that could make a real difference. But he also knew how hard it would be. It would require him to challenge not only the system, but the people within it. People he had worked alongside for years. "I'm in," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'm with you." Jessica's face softened, and for the first time, Michael saw the weight of her journey reflected in her eyes. It wasn't just about fighting the system. It was about taking that fight and turning it into something that could last. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her smile returning. "This is just the beginning. Let's get to work." Michael left the meeting with a new sense of purpose. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But he also knew that this was the path he needed to be on. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something that mattered. And that, he realized, was the real victory. It had been a few months since Michael Turner had committed to being part of Jessica's initiative for reform, and already he could feel the shift within himself. The work had been grueling, filled with countless meetings, discussions, and difficult conversations with colleagues who were resistant to change. But there was something new in the air. Michael was no longer the same officer who once blindly followed the status quo. He was learning to challenge the systems he had once upheld without question. Jessica had given him a platform to make real change, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The initiative was beginning to gain traction, and people were starting to notice. Jessica's push for police accountability was making waves, and more officers, including some of Michael's colleagues, were beginning to listen. It wasn't easy, though. Every time Michael confronted his peers, he was met with resistance, skepticism, and, at times, outright hostility. Some were willing to listen, but others were entrenched in their beliefs, unwilling to acknowledge the flaws within the system. There were moments when Michael felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, but he refused to back down. He couldn't. Every conversation was a small victory, and he learned to hold on to those victories even when the larger picture seemed daunting. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the papers spread out in front of him. He was reviewing a report about a recent case of police misconduct, one that had received national attention. It was yet another reminder of the deep-rooted issues in the system. Michael ran his fingers over his temples, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about making friends or fitting in. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. He thought back to the day Jessica had approached him with the idea of joining her reform initiative. Back then, he had been uncertain, unsure if he could really make a difference. But now, as he sat there looking at the evidence in front of him, he knew that every step he had taken had brought him closer to the kind of change that was desperately needed. Michael had started to speak out more in the department meetings, raising concerns about the practices he had once accepted without question. It wasn't always well received, and he often felt like he was swimming against the current. But something had shifted within him. He was no longer afraid to challenge the old guard, to ask the hard questions, to hold his fellow officers accountable. It wasn't just about making headlines or gaining recognition. It was about creating a culture of transparency and integrity in law enforcement, something that had been missing for far too long. As Michael continued his work with Jessica's initiative, he found that his personal life was beginning to shift as well. His relationships with his colleagues were changing slowly but surely. Some had become more open to the idea of reform, while others had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the changes he was championing. But Michael no longer feared losing their approval. He had found a new sense of purpose, and he knew that the work he was doing was more important than fitting into the old mold. One day, as he sat in a meeting with Jessica and several other community leaders, they discussed plans for a major public event aimed at raising awareness about police reform. It was ambitious, and there were many hurdles to overcome. But Michael was no longer intimidated. He was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Jessica glanced at him across the table, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it, Michael," she said quietly. "This is the turning point. We're not just talking anymore. We're taking action." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. This wasn't just about him or Jessica. It was about all the people who had been affected by a system that had failed them. It was about ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. He was no longer just a police officer in a broken system. He was a part of something bigger. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. It had been nearly a year since Michael Turner had joined Jessica Williams' reform initiative, and the changes in him were undeniable. His colleagues still resisted, but more and more, Michael found allies within his own department. Officers who had grown tired of the status quo and were beginning to see the cracks in the system themselves. The initiative was gaining momentum, and with every passing day, Michael felt more and more certain that this was where he was supposed to be. The work wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. He and Jessica had continued to work closely together, strategizing, organizing, and pushing for concrete reforms that would make a lasting impact on the way law enforcement interacted with communities. Their efforts were starting to be recognized on a larger scale, with media outlets beginning to cover their work and other departments reaching out to learn more about their approach. Michael had become a public advocate for reform, speaking at events, sharing his personal journey, and encouraging others to join the movement. There were times when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He was speaking out against the system he had once been part of, and the resistance from his peers could be overwhelming. But the faces of the people they were fighting for kept him going, the mothers, fathers, and children who had been victims of police violence and systemic discrimination for far too long. One day, after a particularly intense strategy session with Jessica and a group of community leaders, Michael found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He was sitting alone in his car outside the precinct, thinking about everything he had learned, the conversations he had had, and the people who had helped him see the truth. It wasn't just about fixing the police force anymore. It was about changing the entire culture of law enforcement. Michael knew this wasn't something that could be done overnight. Change was slow and often painful, but it was happening, and he could see the difference they were making. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Jessica. Big news. The city council has agreed to hear our proposal for reform next week. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Michael's heart raced. This was it, the moment they had been working toward for so long. It was a chance to bring real, lasting change to the system. He immediately replied, "I'm in. Let's do this." Over the next week, the final preparations were made. Michael had never been more nervous for anything in his life. The weight of what was at stake was enormous. But he knew that the work they had done so far, the countless hours spent strategizing, talking to the community, and challenging the system, had prepared them for this moment. The day of the city council meeting arrived. Michael walked into the building with Jessica and the rest of their team, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. They had spent months crafting their proposal, gathering support from community leaders, and fine-tuning their arguments. This was their opportunity to finally be heard. Inside the council chambers, the atmosphere was tense. The room was packed with people, some hopeful, some skeptical. As Michael stepped up to the podium, he felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall. Jessica had always said that actions spoke louder than words, and now was the time for their actions to speak for them. He took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, members of the council," he started, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "My name is Michael Turner, and I am here today not just as a police officer, but as someone who has come to understand the need for reform in our system. What we are proposing today is not just a set of policies. It is a call for a new way of thinking about law enforcement, a way that values transparency, accountability, and the communities we serve." As he continued speaking, Michael felt the nervousness start to fade. He spoke with conviction, knowing that the future of law enforcement and the future of countless people who had been hurt by it depended on this moment. He shared stories of people he had met, the families who had been torn apart by injustice, and the deep systemic issues that had made reforms so difficult. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, members of the city council began to speak. There was skepticism, but also curiosity. Some seemed to be moved by Michael's words. Others were still resistant, but they were listening. It wasn't an easy battle, but it was a battle Michael knew he couldn't walk away from. After the meeting, as they walked out of the chambers, Jessica looked at him and smiled. "We did it," she said softly. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of pride and relief wash over him. This was just the beginning, but they had made it this far. And for the first time, Michael felt that change was not only possible, it was inevitable.